The Shining is a 1980 Stanley Kubrick film based off a Stephen King novel by the same name. Even if you've never seen the whole movie, you've probably seen enough clips, most famously,
"Here's Johnny!"
or heard enough people talk about it to feel like you've already seen this film. But that's just proof that this is a top-of-the-line addition to the horror thriller genre. I thoroughly enjoyed watching The Shining and have even rewatched it a couple of times, which is saying something since this genre of film is not one that I actively seek out. So I'm going to point out a couple of things that really stood out to me while watching this that made the story so compelling. The appeal for this film doesn't primarily come from the scares, but from its unsettling nature, and I think the narrative originally created by King and then adapted for this movie plays a large part in this. While watching it, I felt like I was trying to figure out a puzzle. This leads to the story being more mentally and psychologically thrilling as a narrative rather than physically horrifying. The way violence is included in the story is given further impact and importance when considering exactly what time in film history The Shining was made. The golden age of slasher films was from 1978 to 1984. The Shining came out in 1980, right in the middle of the slasher craze. When I think of slasher films like Friday the 13th, Halloween, or Texas Chainsaw Massacre, I wouldn't group The Shining as following the format exactly. Stalking and killing are a couple of the prominent characteristics of slasher films, and while the character Jack Torrance does do both of these things, I think the fact that this film isn't overly reliant on it sets it apart from the more concrete slasher films. You can probably count the number of times the viewer actually witnessed something violent occur in the film on one hand, maybe two if you're being really specific. Other films of the same genre would try and cram as much violence in to the point where it becomes senseless, whereas The Shining understands the jarring effect it can have on the story when used more sparingly. Instead of solely using the scenes where Jack does follow the typical action seen in horror films of chasing after people with the intent to kill them as the main source of entertainment and action, the film adds a certain level of intrigue to the motivations behind the character and what led him to be in this state of mind. This is achieved by intentionally leaving the factors that contribute to Jack's final break into madness somewhat unexplained and clouded in mystery. And while there are characters who have violently died, there is only one physically shown death, and it's of a secondary character. Poor Mr. Halloran. That scene, along with the unexpected jump scare I experienced at this moment, are the only two times I physically had a reaction where I jumped and felt like I needed to look away from the movie. This shows just how little the film resorts to violence to carry out the idea that this is indeed a horror film. Above all else, though, my favorite thing that this film does is leave parts of the story open-ended and some of the plot points unexplained like I mentioned before. This invites the viewer to continue to critically think about and try and figure out the rest of the story. There is no definitive end that says nothing like this will ever occur again in the Overlook Hotel. It's this eeriness and unsettling concept that leaves a lasting effect on the viewer and keeps the storyline circulating in their mind. What does that picture of Jack mean? How many times has something like this really happened before? Will it ever happen again? Who's to say what really goes on in those cold winter months at the Overlook Hotel? Although with a sequel in the works, maybe we'll get some answers, whether we want them or not.